Welcome to Metal Matters, a Gimme Radio podcast. I'm your host, Mike Hill, and I'll be leading you on this adventure. We'll be getting into deep discussions about classic records, profiles on up-and-coming bands, and interviews with your favorite artists. You can check out new episodes every week, so be sure to subscribe and never miss out. Thanks for tuning in, guys. This week we have author and musician Anthony Pappalardo of Adult Inc. He joins us this week for another classic records episode. Pappalardo has written about everything from skateboarding to hardcore music to urban lifestyle, and to date, he has 2 books out, Live Suburbia and Radio Silence, A Visual History of American Hardcore. I've known Anthony since the late 90s when I lived in Boston, and he was a founding member for 2 pretty big seminal Boston hardcore, sort of second wave Boston hardcore bands, In My Eyes and 10 Yard Fight, which were, I remember at the time, they were like hugely influential on the scene. And so, I don't know, we stayed friends all these years, and here he is on our show. And if you've been paying attention for the last several months, you'll realize that we sort of think out of the box when it comes to classic records. We don't go for the obvious stuff, so instead, we're going for something that actually packs a little bit of a personal impact to us. So we're going with Garage Days Revisited by Metallica, 1987 EP of covers. The significant thing about this is not only do they do a really cool job of making these songs their own, it sort of opened up a whole new sort of horizon of different types of music to get into. Some bands that actually would become my favorite bands over the years were introduced to me on this record. If you like this episode, please share it. Once again, thanks for listening, and enjoy the next episode.
Going through Metallica's catalog in general, it was like thinking back to like when I discovered that band, and I'm like, I totally forgot that I got into them before they were this thing that people had, like they were so divisive.
Yeah.
Like, I don't like this era. There's not enough, like, I heard them before Justice, so there wasn't the like, there's no fucking bass. Like they were, at that time, like it was something I anticipated. Like, Cliff's dead. What are they going to do?
Yeah. Well, there was no eras. There was just the band.
Yeah.
And
totally.
They were, on the rise, and, they were just a very sort of current, crucial band, and especially in metal. And the way this record ties in, it's like one of they awakened the whole interest I had in the Misfits and Glenn Danzig.
Sure.
Oddly enough, you know what I mean? Because I saw photographs of, James and Cliff. Cliff had that, Misfits shirt. Mm-hmm. I saw James with a GBH t-shirt. And, prior to my listening to Metallica, I'd obviously been into punk rock and hardcore and stuff, but GBH and Misfits were bands in, at least this is like the 1980s, when it wasn't like you could just type in punk rock music and like a million bands show up. That those bands actually were bands that weren't necessarily on my radar. Ironically, being you and I both being East Coasters, the Misfits being from New Jersey, I didn't really hear about it until I saw James Hetfield wearing a friggin', Misfits t-shirt. Yeah,
I think this was coming in the moment where I'm like really, I'm diving into punk, hardcore, metal, kind of all at once. It just was kind of like the same thing.
Yeah.
And skateboarding. And so because of the skateboard mags had a lot of great music coverage, and the metal mags, I had subscriptions to a bunch of metal mags. Like I just wanted any piece of information. And so the crossover was super interesting because Pushead's linked to Metallica, Pushead's writing for Thrasher. And it just started, I think, just to backtrack, what I always thought was cool about Metallica, regardless of their music, was that they were really happy to show you their influences. They're always wearing t-shirts of other bands, and like that was still in an era where like bands wore get-ups, or if they wore t-shirts, it was of their band.
Yeah, right, like Dave Mustaine and Metallica, but Megadeth, there was the faux pas of wearing every member wearing a Megadeth t-shirt in their video.
Yeah, exactly. So seeing these guys like wearing like a Gas Dunk t-shirt or Septic Death, that was pretty cool to me. And then how it parlayed into this record, because I think, because before that, getting like the EPs that had like, Am I Evil or whatever, I was like, these guys are like, it's pretty cool that they're like, they're digging for covers,
Yeah.
And then I guess, so this one specifically, I want to say, like, I think, hopefully my timeline isn't skewed, but I had a subscription to Rip magazine. I just remember because it came out and it was super cheap. It was like $10 or something. And I think it was either there, like Metal Maniacs or something, like reading that like they're working on this new thing with the new bass player. And I think that was like really all. I don't think there was much information, they weren't getting coverage even on MTV at the time or anything.
No, that was way before the one video. Mm-hmm. And that was like, when most fans felt sort of slighted because Metallica vowed never to make a video and all this other stuff. But, that video was like, 6.5 minutes long, this like epic, totally depressing song, very brutal, like subject matter. So I think it justified, them making a video with that song in mind.
Yeah, if they were going to do it, they went for the bum out. So I'll give them that.
Which is almost, it's funny, it's almost the inverse of, say, like, Poison's Every Rose Has Its Thorn. Because one is a ballad, but it's like the darkest ballad I've ever heard ever. You know what I mean?
I remember at that time, too, when that song got popular, you would hear it occasionally in really fucking awkward places. Because it's like someone would feel obligated to play it or something. It's like a school dance, like what the fuck?
Yeah, then the brutal part at the ending comes up. Yeah,
it's like DJ's trying to cut it. But I remember seeing advertisements for this record for Garage Days, and probably being one of the few records I remember getting when it came out.
I definitely did, because the time when it came out, I was like hugely into them. And now the time it came out, it was 1987. And the record was the Garage Days 598. 598.
Yep.
Okay. Because on iTunes, it's actually $5.99. There's an extra cent thrown in there. Isn't that funny?
Inflation calculator.
Isn't that funny, though, that it's $5.99?
Yeah. Insane.
It's also known as the 998 CD. Because, CDs were like a new format back then, too. Released on Elektra and Vertigo being their UK label. Recorded at the A&M Studios in Santa Monica, California, and Conway Studios in LA. Now that line I just read off there about production always blew my mind, that this throwaway record, it's not a throwaway record, but something that was done purportedly on the cheap, sort of like lo-fi, was still recorded at 2 studios.
Oh yeah, and it was I was digging into a little bit. It was like some leftover time from a Ted Nugent session or something. Just pretty incredible. I mean, I don't even think to me, when I heard it, I probably read the liner notes once, and I'm just assumed like they did it in their garage.
That's what I thought too.
Yeah.
For like probably 20 years, I thought they recorded it in Lars Ulrich's garage. I think, to be honest, I'm going to be completely frank, that while preparing for this episode, I, to this day, thought that they recorded it on like an 8-track or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And what's most important about this, though, is this Jason Newsted's first recorded material with the band. Mm-hmm. And it consists of covers. And what's even more insane is that for a record that is all covers, it charted number 28 on the Billboard.
Yeah, so I think what I had read, because I remember reading tons of articles when this came out, because there was actually like a big PR push. They were being pushed by the record label to do this. They're about to play Monsters of Rock at Castle Donington. Record label wants them to have something, to have a little energy. And what they actually were going to put out was a new song. So they had a demo version of Blackened. And they made this pivot and said, no, we're actually going to do a bunch of songs and come up with this EP and this low-priced EP. And I thought it was, it seemed like a cool way to introduce him, like a low-pressure situation.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's just sort of this harkening back to the old days when they were playing covers, probably in the beginning of their career as a band, playing some Tigers of Pantang covers and whatever.
Right.
Just grabbing a bunch of tracks that they all were, thought were cool. And I wonder if Newsted actually had any input on that.
Yeah, I'd be curious too. I mean, you hear about the intense hazing, like, would you have been scared to propose something? Who knows? Like, it's pretty interesting. I mean, they, again, like, I hate to have a caveat to everything about pre-digital, but I think it's more of a way to say what they did was important. How, Metallica, and say what you will about Lars Ulrich, like, they were curators. They would proudly talk about, new wave British heavy metal, where no one else was, everyone else was, I think, had too much ego to even say where they came from. And I think that's really cool that they lead into the record with this Diamond Head cover, and because a lot of these genres that we talk about now, like, they weren't vernacular then, they weren't things, but like when you hear them constantly name check these bands, it drives that interest, and a lot of that stuff was hard to find then as well.
Well, Lars Ulrich, I mean, I know that he's a polarizing figure, in the metal world, but I actually give him a lot of props for introducing me to the terminology of, new wave of British heavy metal, because that's the first time I literally heard that term being used was by him in an interview. Mm-hmm. The first time I ever heard the term black metal being used was by Lars Ulrich back in like 1985 or something like that, when he was talking about Venom. And it was, an interview I heard on the radio, like on some metal shop, WXCI like thing. And, and even to this day, I mean, in the last few years, they had that festival that Metallica did. I can't remember the name of that, but they would put together builds of current bands. So I feel like, they have always seemed like fans of music to me.
Yeah, I think that's like pretty authentic about them.
Yeah, and like even though even current bands like Mastodon and for better or for worse, some of the other selections they had on that bill that they put together, they always were very interested in music, and I think that's what really appealed to the personalities or personas that the band had when I was growing up and getting into music. And so this record, when I bought it, I didn't know that when I purchased this record that it was covers.
Yeah, same.
And I thought these are like some ripping, like super raw, like Metallica songs. And once I discovered that they were covers, I was like, oh, this is like, it completely introduced me to all this new material that had been around for years that I didn't even know about, So let's just run down, I guess, the track listing. Like you mentioned, it kicks off with a Diamond Head song, "Helpless." Then it goes into "Holocaust," "The Small Hours," "The Wait" by The Killing Joke. Very important track for me. "Crash Course in Surgery" by Budgie, and "Last Caress," "Green Hell" by the Misfits. 5 songs.
That's it. Yeah. It seems a lot longer.
It does seem longer. And what's interesting about the Holocaust song is this is what blows my mind, is that song only appeared on a live video from 1981.
Right.
Like that's the only media that medium that appeared in. And it wasn't until like the 90s when Holocaust put out a record, Hypnosis of Birds, that a recording of their own track came out, like a formal recording of it. And who the hell knows how, I mean, that's to like be so inspired by a song that only appears on a live video, I think is pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's digging. And I think what speaks, because that's actually that I couldn't find anything about Holocaust back then. Like this is only like YouTube era that I'm seeing other tracks. A lot of their stuff is not good. It's a little like, like that Metal Maniacs song or whatever. Like it's like, you wouldn't think it was the same band.
No,
I don't want to say not good. It's like this track is more of this brooding outlier. And
yeah. Well, have you heard their formal actual studio version of the song?
Yeah.
Holocaust. Yeah. Yeah. It's a little, of its time. I mean, it's actually worse yet. It came out, I think, in 1994. So it's a 1994 version of a song being of its time in 1980.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like kind of like a weird, sort of, vibe to have on a song like that. And probably I imagine they released their own version of it on the success of this record, I imagine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think what's really cool about this song is it's just like it introduces, and again, they're all covers, but it introduces this tempo that Metallica would later explore, or kind of had explored on Master of Puppets to some degree. But you kind of hear where their dynamics are. Like every track on this is informing their dynamics, whether it's like a really ripping song like Helpless, kind of like that mid-tempo groove of the Budgie track, how they can kind of get like a little dark and textural, Killing Joke. But the Holocaust song, it's really, really, it's a weird song, and it was a cool choice for them. And who would have ever heard that band? Like they immediately put it in the hands of 500,000 people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, probably my two favorite tracks are the Killing Joke track and the track we're talking about, the Small Hours. Like I was like the creepy vibe of that record, that song. And when I heard The Weight, now the first time through this record, I thought The Weight was a Metallica song, and I have enough self-confidence to say that to everyone out there and without any ego. I was a kid, and the information sort of like oozed back to me that it was actually this band called The Killing Joke. And hearing that song, it sounded like like the original version of it had the same spirit, but the execution was completely different.
Yeah,
you know
right.
what I mean? And The Killing Joke would become a band that I've drawn influence from for like since then for the next like 20 years of my life. I mean, they're like one of my favorite all-time bands. And eventually I probably would have found them, but this kind of expedited the whole, went right to the point. It's like, okay, here's a band. It's like Lars is like, hey, you're hanging out with Lars, and he's like, you got to check this band out because this band is like the shit,
It had like, there's two really interesting things about this record. One, it had that like personal touch where it felt like you're like, the cool older dudes kind of passing some knowledge down to you. And then also it's the recording itself is like, I'd thought about this beforehand. Anyone who's ever done a band and they're so fucking psyched about their band, right? It's the best thing they've ever done. And they hang the mic from the rafter in the ceiling and you blaze through these songs and you think it's the greatest shit of all time and you put it on and it's always bad.
Yeah.
Like,
it's just mono recording of like a fucking room.
Like this is like the dream version of that. Like this is what when you put that tape in and when you hit play after that, like you want it to sound like this.
Yeah, like in your mind, this is what you're making, this record.
Exactly.
Like you're doing covers of Dio or whatever,
Yep.
It's funny, man. That was like step two. I remember in one band I played in years ago when we both lived in Boston. It was like, okay, we had our first practice. Step two is buy a boombox for recording.
Yeah, of course.
For recording purposes. So I remember running out to, you remember the Arsenal Mall, like out in Watertown?
Sure.
So I had like an hour to kill before practice, and I was looking for a boombox, and all I found was they only had these things with like a tape player and like one speaker, man. Mm-hmm. Like I couldn't find the full stereo boombox, and you had a cassette tape that you put in there, and you just kind of hit play and record and hope for the best. Now that is something nowadays. Everyone's got like multi-track. On your phone, you can make a better recording than a boombox. So that technology's lost, probably for the best, though, I think.
I feel like, I don't know, I would know some people who are a little more savvy and they'd like rig up something through a receiver so it's like 2 channels or something, and like it was still terrible, but it would like you're like, oh, it's a little better, it's like left and right or something, But yeah, I mean, it has that. It does feel like they're all, I know the setup is that they practice in Lars' garage, but it sounds like they're butting up against each other in this room and like really tearing it out. And that Killing Joke song in particular is such a different song for Metallica. It's so gripping right away. And then I think how I got into Killing Joke after that was like that song 80s was still pretty big on like alternative radio.
Yeah.
And I kind of put 2 and 2 together and I'm like, but I don't know, how could that be the same band? Like I know they made it heavier. And then I kind of dug back, and like, it's a really interesting catalog that band has of, the rawness of the early recordings, the tempo of the early recordings. Then, like a lot of bands, getting into the 80s, like maybe adding synths or different arrangements, but then how they eventually land at getting heavier again, which was, as a fan of that band, to hear like, the track "Money Is Not Our God" after like loving, some of the records before that, and like they just come out with this like pretty like, it's almost like a metal PIL or something. It's like really cool.
It still has that angular sort of, like the angular guitar stuff going on in it, but it has a lot more aggression. And it's funny, like you mentioned that, but part of me wonders if Killing Joke were referencing Metallica being into them. So there's like this weird circular, like at some point the Killing Joke might have been like, these like heavier bands, like these metal kids, like kind of dig the band. So, some of the stuff's pretty cool. Let's like incorporate some of these influences that they produce, into our music.
Yeah. Also because where else could they go? Right. Like they have these, like, they're big in America, but they're not, they're not like mainstream big in America. And they have these recognizable songs. They have like these really great pop songs, like
definitely
Love Like Blood or whatever. It's like, all right, they probably did hit some type of a wall and say like, maybe we should plug into like who actually likes us, or like these different markets,
Yeah. It's at the time, in the 80s, a band like guys like Metallica being into like a quote unquote post-punk band was kind of like a big deal for me, because, going back to that era of time, that sort of, there was only punks and metalheads, and none of these groups really mixed very well. You know what I mean? There are kids who are into like goth, maybe they like punk, metal dudes definitely stuck within their realm. Like they didn't really venture out too hard into other areas, and the fact that they liked a band like that really, it was really intense for me, because I was like, I had a girlfriend who was into like Bauhaus and Joy Division and stuff, and I was like, oh yeah, this is like pretty cool. And it was almost like, being like a young man, a kid, you have all these like barriers and these walls that you put around yourself as to what, at least I did, this is okay. This fits the, who you are. This is what you're supposed to be into. That other stuff like, Killing Joke, Bauhaus, Joy Division, Sisters of Mercy, like stuff like that was not really, I needed someone to validate that in a way. So Metallica covering the Killing Joke song kind of validated that whole world for me. And I was able to kind of like explore that on my own afterwards.
Well, yeah, because when so around the time like 87, when this record's out, as much as I'm getting into a lot of things, I'm like very careful about what I show the world I'm into.
Yeah, totally. Yep.
And like, before you kind of curated your social media to who you were, you curated your clothing to who you were. And that's like really how you communicated. So the real estate on your jean jacket or whatever, it's like pretty precious. And, I would actually think about this shit of like, oh, should that logo go on? Because like that band's, am I going to look corny if there's like a Motley Crue logo or something, and I'm supposed to be into like heavier shit or whatever.
Yeah, totally.
And you would definitely not put like Bauhaus or whatever. But I remember I met this one kid in high school, this kid who transferred over, and he was like this long hair, kind of, I don't know, he was more like a sleazy hippie. Like he wasn't a good hippie. He was like an evil hippie. And he had this jacket, and it had a Grateful Dead patch, a Metallica patch, Black Flag bars, and I want to say The Cure or something else. And like, I remember kind of like asking him like, dude, like, how do you like all that? And he's like, it's my fucking jacket, man. And I was
that's sick. That's
awesome.
awesome.
It's like,
yeah, it's
like, fuck you. And like, we were already off to a bad start,
Yeah.
Like,
but at that age, that I wasn't ready for that kind of freedom, though. You know what I mean?
No, not
it's
at
like
all.
You think that you're free in your brain, you think your mind is open, but you really are in this box still. I forget about like jazz or whatever, other things
Right.
I've gotten into over the years too. I was like, all right, I only listen to like Black Flag, and Slayer and Metallica, and like those are the only bands I might listen to X and the Germs, Cro-Mags,
right.
and that was it. But like when someone within that circle gives you that pass to like, okay, check this out. I listen to this shit too. And then I saw I think it was James was wearing like a Faith No More t-shirt too.
Yeah, I remember that.
Now, as much as like these days, people that are into quote unquote extreme music embrace Mike Patton as one of us, extreme music guys. In 1980s, they were like the Red Hot Chili Peppers or something.
Oh, totally. Especially like the Chuck Mosley era.
Yeah,
like
totally.
They were almost like those were bands that would get played on like Dr. Demento.
Yep.
It was almost like, it's a lost genre, but like joke rock, almost in a sense,
Yeah.
I think that's where they had to. I think the other thing that's important to think of is that the music festival, especially in the United States, hadn't hit, remotely where it is now. So the closest you would get is like these metal festivals that they're playing in Europe, like the Monsters of Rock. Like that was pretty revolutionary for curating things, but you weren't going to have Killing Joke on that festival.
No, definitely.
It was still going to be very genre tight. And we didn't, credit Perry Farrell for being kind of the first one to actually modernize that idea. You know?
I mean, even the Monsters of Rock in the United States, which I went to,
Yeah.
was like supposedly, I'm like, oh, what a diverse bill. It's got Van Halen, Dokken, Metallica, Scorpions, and Kingdom Come. Oh yeah, there's all kinds of genres of music. To me at the time, I'm like, oh, look at all these different types of bands, but yet, it was all these heavy metal bands, and it was really funny because Metallica with Newsted played that, and they went on. I think they went on second or third. Kingdom Come went on first. Metallica may have gone on second, then the Scorpions, then Dokken, and then Van Halen, and I was like right up front. It was in Giant Stadium. Out in Jersey, and I was like two rows away from the front. It was just like insane, like pit. And I looked up into the bleachers, and someone had lit like some seat on fire and whatever. And it was like chaos, man. And Jason Newsted was wearing a Ramones t-shirt.
Oh, that's sick.
Yeah. Later that night, when Van Halen was getting ready to play, I was still fairly close to the front, and some dude like forces his way all the way to the front. He's like this, like a long-haired, like the kind of kid, like a thrash kid, not like some dude who's in the Dokken or Van Halen or whatever, right? So he gets up front and he's like, oh, cool, man. It's like, I can't wait to see Metallica. I'm like, bro, they played like fucking 4 hours ago. Like in his mind, Metallica was bigger than Van Halen.
I mean, if you were a fan of that band at that time, they were, it was that band like on that rise, they're like everyone liked that band if you liked a certain type of thing, like if you liked heavy music, you liked that. You weren't going to meet someone who's like, yeah, they're all right. Like they were kind of the gold standard. And then I think it's funny if you butt them up against Slayer. Like Slayer later did that covers record, but they were smart enough to do the club tour as well.
Yeah,
which was really cool.
Yeah, I was gonna bring that up actually about that was like almost 10 years later. I think Slayer that came out in '96, that Undisputed Attitude record. But that one lacks the charm, though. I think
so too. It's a band doing a cover EP because the cover EP suddenly became this bridge thing.
Yeah,
I mean. I know Metallica loves to claim they did everything first, but that was a cover record, was a pretty interesting thing to do for a band, especially a band that wasn't fully like globally established yet.
Yeah. Because
prior to that, cover records were like how you recorded a record when you didn't have enough songs or that the record label wanted to break you. So, okay, you do a couple blues covers or whatever.
Yeah.
Pepper them in with your tracks. Like,
sure.
No one's, the Beatles never did a cover record. Zeppelin, maybe their career was a cover record, but
yeah, Zeppelin took credit for a lot of stuff that they didn't write.
Sure.
But, actually Van Halen is always good with covers too.
Yeah. They would always like throw in some like, that always felt like the vaudeville, David Lee Roth angle or something like.
Yeah. I mean, like one of their biggest songs, You Really Got Me, is, it's a Kinks cover, But then again, this wasn't, the Kinks song, You Really Got Me, was like a big song for them too.
Yeah.
But none of these tracks were big at all. And a lot of these bands on this record were still remain in obscurity, like Holocaust,
Right. I
mean, Diamond Head, people reference them. Killing Joke, obviously, at that, even when this record came out, still had they were they had a career. Like
sure,
Holocaust, known primarily for this song.
Absolutely, I mean that sparked their career again, I guess.
And Budgie is a band that heavy rock fans know who they are, and of course the Misfits are equally legendary, but at the time weren't though.
Yeah, I mean, I think it might have been in between, because I know like some of the stuff had gone out of print like before those collections came out and stuff. Yeah, you'd almost say like the Misfits were maybe of the selection the most recognizable band, but like in the time that's passed from there, I think a lot, Killing Joke, obviously, Budgie have become sort of symbolic of like a style type of person, I think like in going through of all the bands, digging and trying to find all these bands, or not that it was hard to find the Misfits or Killing Joke, but getting excited to find these bands, and like I wanted to hear what Metallica heard in them if I wasn't familiar with them, right? Budgie was the most disappointing, I thought. Yeah,
like didn't quite line up.
And exactly. It's not a slight to that band. It's just that it's more a testament of Metallica owning that song and being like, okay, with a different vocal delivery and like amped up a little much, like this is going to sound heavy as fuck and be a killer song. And, it's one of those rare instances where I think the cover is much better than the original.
Even the Angel Witch track they did, not Angel Witch, the Am I Evil song they did from that 12-inch.
Yeah.
Even the Metallica version of that song, I think, is better than the original.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was something about, like, I think they're good at, like, figuring out, like, how the delivery of a riff can make a song. Like, that riff in Am I Evil, it's such a killer riff. Like, you hear it and you're like, I want to play it. I want to destroy things to it. But the original version, the Diamond Head version, like, it doesn't have that punch. But just the way Metallica executes it, it changes that whole thing. And when they're playing together in the room and everyone's kind of like, they got this energy, this new member, and probably like a lot to prove. So, they transform all these riffs, like every single one of these songs.
It's a lot of it probably could be attributed to the fact that all of these bands started out playing covers. I mean, that was like, I don't think bands do that anymore, really.
Yeah, you're right.
I think that bands...
The band is a cover. So someone was like, not to interrupt, someone had mentioned this, I feel like on another podcast, that a lot of these bands start like school science projects. Like when you mix these two things, you're going to get this result. So, okay, we like this genre, so we're just going to emulate it. So, like, there's no variables to it.
Yeah.
So, like, the band is a cover because they're just doing like loose covers of a genre or something,
Yeah.
I think a lot of it in the 80s too, or like when we probably started first playing music, you had to find 3 or 4 people who even liked the same shit.
Oh, dude, it was impossible almost. You know what I mean? And there'd always be like the one guy who kind of is not really on the same page.
Yep.
I used to feel like in Sick of It All, Richie was the guy, like the dude with the mustache.
Yeah,
hair.
Totally.
Like he was like the guy who didn't really like, maybe wasn't 100% on the same page as the other guys.
Yeah.
Like, but you'd oftentimes see like a band, all dudes have shaved heads, and like one guy's got a mustache and like long hair, because he was like the guy who liked Sacred Reich or something, and he saw Sick of It All like when Sacred Reich play together or something, and then he got into like hardcore as a result of that.
There would always be some opening band, like they would kind of sound like AF, and it would be like, 3 or 4 skinhead looking dudes, and then one dude with like sunglasses, just like
like a gold chain.
Yeah, just like, all right, well he can play, like you had to have that guy in there.
But I think Phil Anselmo, actually, there was an interview I read with him where he was talking about like his experience growing up where, you had all these records in your record collection, and when you listen to the band, you can hear like 20 or 30 different records in your band's sound. And he's like, nowadays you hear like 3 records.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. I mean, yeah, it's also too like these, we take it for granted, but Metallica's inventing a sound too, which is a lot harder to do now. So,
oh yeah, definitely.
Like it's the same thing with like, there's always going to be someone who plays you a band that sounded like Sonic Youth before Sonic Youth or whatever, right? Like someone, like these ideas were out there in the ether, someone nailed it, whatever. Yeah, obviously trying to invent a sound or, hash something out from the ground up now is, I don't want to say impossible. It's more challenging.
Yeah, it's definitely more challenging because a lot of stuff's been done within, the bandwidth of this type of stuff is pretty well documented and traversed right now. Are there any tracks on here that stick out with you that were particularly meaningful to you?
I mean, we talked about the Holocaust track. Diamond Head was a band that, so at the time, and it had to be somewhat off because they were like, I forget what, they might have been on Dutch East or something like in the US, or they had some distribution, but I think some level of success with Metallica made like a little discography cassette or something available. So I remember getting that because they actually had it at like the, Tape World. I think it was called Tape, like that chain Tape World had that record. So I got back into that. I think the ultimate standout still is the cover of The Weight. It's that band flexing a different muscle. The production's like a little weird, even though the production is pretty much what it is for the whole thing. But, they took some risks with it, and it opened me up to the fact that post-punk, I didn't know much about it, and I didn't realize how heavy some of that stuff was. And so it exposed me to like a different type of heavy. And I think had I not had a curiosity about Killing Joke, I probably would have lost out on hundreds of bands.
Yeah.
And like, just because I think there was by what was getting filtered down to me through like the college radio or alternative music, it was still a lot of what you're getting is that very like gauzy, pretty, more of a pop sound or whatever, like whether it's the Smiths or, the poppier Cure songs or whatever. And you weren't getting the stuff that almost is hitting on this intersection like post-punk industrial. So just the fact that this like little, under $6 cassette unlocked a couple worlds to me, like this new wave of British heavy metal, Killing Joke and like heavier post-punk. And then also, making me want to explore the Misfits more. Cause I wasn't a huge Misfits fan when this came out. I'll fully admit that, I probably liked Danzig more.
Yeah. I liked the way their artwork looked, you know what I mean? And like I said, back then you couldn't just go on YouTube and look stuff up. You had to put down hard-earned cash, or you have to have a friend who was into it. You know what I mean? And it's funny because there's certain things that, you just would assume that your friends would have records of these bands, And I can tell you, like when I was a kid, my friends had Bad Brains, they had Black Flag, they had DOA, they had Ramones, Dead Kennedys, Suicidal, Circle Jerks, right? Stuff like X, The Germs, okay? No Misfits. No one had a Misfits record.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? No one had a Misfits record while we were all discovering punk and hardcore music. And, so it wasn't until 1987 I saw people wearing these cool shirts with a skull, and I was like way into that idea. Horror, vampires, zombies, that's like right up my alley.
Sure.
And I'm like, okay, cool. So it's like, okay, I'm a teenager. I don't have any money. Do I buy this record or do I buy like, Cause for Alarm by Agnostic Front? You know what I mean? I don't know. I go for Cause for Alarm instead because I'm familiar with that. Even though there's this cool skull and there's a name like Legacy of Brutality, which is like such a killer title. But then when I heard, in '87 when this came out, I was like, oh, okay, this is like, it passed like the first test for me. The songs like had a sound that I understood and I was familiar with. And then I went and I bought Legacy of Brutality, which is the first Misfits record I got into. And obviously I was into that. It's a little bit different though. Mm-hmm. I didn't really, and it's funny because now you just take it for granted. Glenn Danzig and the Misfits are synonymous, but I was like, oh, this kind of sounds like that guy Danzig.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, damn, it's the same dude. And then, of course, there was Sam Hain, and it's like, I mean, this is like the primitive times that we lived in back then.
Sure.
It was primitive.
Yeah, you're if you don't have access, like if you don't even know what a zine is, like the best intel you're getting is out of a metal magazine.
Yeah.
And that's like not, it's not the highest quality writing. It's not the most well-researched
No,
stuff.
Definitely not.
I think it was cool that they did a song with both sides of the Misfits. Like I thought that was really cool because then I got Earth AD first. Mm-hmm. And then I think the reason why I didn't get super into the Misfits, like the energy just wasn't going. It's like, I'm like, Earth AD, this is fucking amazing. And then I'm like, well, I got to get something else. And Walk Among Us, it's like two entirely different, like it sounded like so much like oldies.
Yeah, definitely.
In a way.
It had like a very, Elvis kind of evil Elvis vibe to it, Same thing with Legacy too.
Yeah.
That those two records, those are my favorite Misfits records though.
Oh yeah.
I like the dark Elvis, that's like
totally.
my total, that whole like midnight ride kind of vibe that they had back then, and I even like the Danzig songs that actually have that, like Sistinus, like that song's beautiful, man, and like I appreciate him mostly when he's doing those kind of ballady, like, swan songy type songs,
Yeah, that's
really,
his lane. Yeah.
That's definitely his forte, in my opinion.
See, like, I think also too, like at that age, you're like 13, 14, whatever. I'm still like charging forward. Like I'm still Sonic the Hedgehog. Like I'm like, what's faster? What's heavier?
Yeah.
What's darker? What's this? Like a lot of times along the way, you hear something that you recognize as great, but you don't run with it. Like then a little later, you're like, shit, I want to listen to like the first 4 Ramones records and like now, like I live by those or whatever. Or a lot of, I think, when you're in that zone, maybe you hear a lot of British punk. It's like some of the greatest stuff. But when you're looking for like, you're like, there's got to be something heavier than the Cro-Mags. It doesn't exactly like resonate, right away. Like you get in these little paths, I think.
Yeah, I never really dug British punk until much later in my life. Like I remember, when the word punk started coming into my like, my mind, my vernacular, people were talking about it, and I was understanding what it was. I check out the Clash. Now the Clash, honestly, in 2019, looking back at the Clash, I'll have to say the Clash were not a punk band.
No.
You know what I mean? Like, but in 1985 or whatever, yeah. I mean, they were this self-proclaimed punk band, but I don't think that, Discharge thought the Clash were punks.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think maybe in when they formed an ethos, but like they're also there's those bands that are like they're coming over from pub rock.
Yeah.
Yeah,
totally.
So it's like it's kind of it gets a little blurry as to what the intention is and what I don't know. They have a couple, just like any of the bands of that era, they have a couple like fast-paced songs, and they have a lot of songs that are influenced by like reggae music and stuff, and it's like you can trace that the speed is the Ramones. Like the Ramones come over and that changes. I mean, everyone will admit that, the imprint of that band, they almost go underrated in what they did.
Yeah, well, for me, the Ramones were probably the Ramones were the first punk show or punk rock show I've ever went to ever, and that changed everything for me. Seeing the Ramones and discovering them, because like there was one, back when I was 12, 13, I think. There's this older guy, Mike Katz, who he was he was like the cool guy, the coolest guy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he played drums. He's an incredible drummer. Like he was always like 2 steps ahead of everybody on like what music was happening. And he was like totally into metal, right? Long hair, you know, he had the whole look down. But then like he went to California one summer, and when he came back that year, the following school year, his hair was gone. He had like dyed blonde, you know, earring, leather jacket with the Road to Ruin, you know, Ramones album cover on the back. And now everyone had to be in the Ramones because Mike Katz was in the
Right.
Ramones.
He was leading that new.
He was leading the meeting. And then I'm like, oh, I have to check this out now because Mike Katz is listening to them. And I have to figure out like where I fit into this whole continuum of music. And they were like, at that time, the fastest, most like extreme band I'd ever heard.
Right.
You know? And then shortly after that, the mixtape of one side, Group Sex, the other side, First Suicidal record that started making its rounds. And then the Pay to Come 7-inch, and then the cassette of mixed Bad Brains records. All this like stuff from like the Roar cassette that we dubbed and started passing around to everybody. But yeah, it all starts with the Ramones for me, man. Totally. You know.
Yeah, I mean they're so obvious that they're underrated in what they do. You know, it's like they're just such an iconic thing. But again, like you step back into any of these bands, you know, like they're the originators of these things. You know, like when Black Flag starts to really change and get weird, they're the originators of a punk band doing that. You know, when Metallica is kind of fusing a couple different things and coming up with this style, and you know, it's cool to hear how it was informed. You know, and to kind of go back, I think what's interesting in this record is it comes out at a time where no one could predict how big they were getting and where the ride was going to go. And as if, you know, as the 13-year-old version of myself or whatever the fuck age I was, 14, I'm like, I live and die by this band. And that the ride fizzled out pretty quick for me after that.
Yeah. That was, because let's ask the timeline of their career though. That was before Injustice for All came out. And Injustice for All was like the big, that's what blew them. I feel like they blew up on that record.
Absolutely.
Like they were headlining like Coliseums and stuff. You know, I remember they played at like the Worcester Centrum or something.
And it also is when SoundScan actually comes out. So they actually, their records are like charting where they should be. You know, it's like it's changing how, because before these are like guesstimates. They were pretty much just like buying chart positions.
Oh, okay.
So now, I believe it's Justice. I would not want to be wrong and say it was the Black Album, but I believe there was a shift in the industry of how they're tracking records and like early SoundScans coming out. And that's why like you can't deny what they're doing because they're selling so many, you know?
Yeah. But prior to this was Master of Puppets, and they were still like opening for Ozzy, and they were doing, you know, like playing places like L'Amour's and stuff during that part of their career. So this record kind of bridged, you know, I mean, the tragic death of Cliff Burton, you know, bridged the old version of the band, the kind of first 4 years of their career or whatever, first like, you know, 6 years of their career into like the mega stardom, you know. And it's like a nice sort of bridge to show like, okay, this is like what our roots are. And then a year later, or what, 88 is, when did Injustice for All come out?
It has to be 88.
It was 88, right? Yeah. Then that record comes out, and then suddenly they're everywhere. Video, headlining big ass arenas, you know what I mean? And then ever since then, it's just been like...
And it's kind of funny, like, you know, there must have been some, you know, I hate to project, but like there must have been something in this process where they're learning these songs like as tight as they can, like probably listening to the originals. When you listen to Injustice for All, this is almost like the roots of these songs are like the blueprints of all the things that happen in that record.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, I think, other than a couple slower songs on Master of Puppets, it's in the same lane, and that's why it's a great record, because it's just like unrelenting. Then when they want to slow it down and do these brooding songs, cool. But you're not getting like a big variance. Whereas Justice is like, it's almost a different band from song to song.
Yeah, there's a lot of dynamics on that record. You know what I mean? And it's, I mean, where does that fall for you as a fan of Metallica and Justice for All?
I would be fucking lying if I didn't say I loved that record when it came out.
Yeah, me too.
I loved it. I didn't care about the bass or the production, like everyone's saying it was thin. I wanted to hear it so bad. So I'm like, yeah, you fucking play me Blackened, I'm gonna love it. You know, like Harvester of Sorrow. Like I'm there. I'm in it. You know, and also the other thing too, like if I'm ranking it, it's not my favorite. You know.
What's your favorite?
That's maybe Ride the Lightning, actually.
Yeah, Ride the Lightning's. It's between Ride the Lightning and Justice for All for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, Ride the Lightning's got the most, I think, sort of epic songs on it. You know, they're like the ones that really, you know, like For Whom the Bell Tolls, man.
Yeah, Creeping Death.
Creeping Death, man. For Whom the Bell. I have when I say For Whom the Bell Tolls, I go back to that time I saw them at Monsters of Rock, and when they,
yeah,
there was like. I felt like I was in danger when I heard that
yeah,
part, and
yeah.
just the reaction of everyone was this like vehement like intensity, man. And that, you know, obviously is on Ride the Lightning, and prior to seeing him play that song, Ride the Lightning was still my favorite band because it had similar dynamics. I think there was a lot of dynamics on that record.
Yeah, I don't know. The other thing too is like. There was it's not like fucking Beatlemania, but there was some kind of like underdog shit with Metallica getting so big.
Yeah.
Because it was kind of like, oh, you thought I was a fucking dirtbag for liking this band? Now you're playing in your Camaro. Fuck you.
Yep.
You know, and then I'm excited to see them. And they were doing a lot of, at the time, radio's getting really behind them. And they're replaying live shows of them. And because of that, there was one show in particular. I got a live show of them, taped it off the radio, sounded super good, and that was like my bargaining chip to tape trade.
Nice.
Through the back pages of I think it was RIP.
Yeah.
So I got the No Life to Leather demo by trading this thing because it happened to be a set where they did a lot of rad covers. So I think they even did like Bread Fan before they did like a recorded version of it on there. Diamond Head cover, Blitzkrieg. I forget what else, but I just remember this being like kind of a, like when I would tell people the set list, they're like, fuck, I need, you know, that's like my bargaining chip, you know,
yeah,
and I got some cool stuff out of that. I actually got I got a tape of a bunch of New York City hardcore demos as a throw-in from this girl in New York City that I traded this demo to, this live recording to. And she was like, yeah, if you like hardcore, check out all this stuff. So it was like, Raw Deal, Breakdown, and
cool.
I'd never heard, you know, I had no point of reference almost for it. So, I mean, it was a cool thing, but yeah, to see, there was a lot of energy behind it, and then they're doing their, you know, like that's their real headlining tour after that, where the stage falls down, and you didn't know, it wasn't on, you didn't get a heads up the stage is going to fall down, you know, so.
Yeah, you know, it's funny, you know, it's 2019, you know, Metallica, household name. You know, we think of them in the same way we think of, you know, Alice in Chains or Soundgarden or any of these big bands, you know, but it really was when no one could project that they would become as big as they did. And it also was a win, sort of like you said, for the underdog, because, you know, James Hetfield wasn't Vince Neil, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You know, he wasn't any of those people. He wasn't even Axl Rose, you know what I mean? And the success of Guns N' Roses, I felt, was more predictable than than Metallica becoming huge, because, you know, there was like, you know, there was a passageway for them to get there. There was a path. There was Aerosmith. There was bands like that, American hard rock bands. But Metallica, thrash, extreme music, you know, the sort of melding of, you know, punk and metal and all this stuff together was destined to remain in this subterranean world. And then Metallica became such a huge mainstream force. It almost is like if the Cro-Mags had actually become, you know, a massive band. It was the same kind of thing almost, in a way.
The other thing too that goes, I think, underappreciated, and because people have so many feelings about Metallica, they don't get credit for just opening up a model for bands, like for bands playing heavier music. Being the first band to do that and show the power behind it, you probably don't, Pantera doesn't go on to the success they have. I would even argue that a lot of things that maybe happened, even like, I don't like it, but like Korn or Slipknot, like if you don't open that door in that way and put everyone on notice, it's like that changes the course of music, and because it was really, 1987, the biggest bands on the radio are like U2, still Bruce Springsteen, like Aerosmith's comeback is starting around then, right?
Yep. That Pump and Permanent Vacation.
Permanent Vacation. Motley Crue's still big. I mean, in contrast, for Metallica to break through, especially with this weird ballad,
yeah,
it's pretty striking. And I think it opened up. I think it showed the world. It showed that there was a need for something. And then if you think of, what comes off that, it's like you probably don't even have an Ozfest in a weird way.
Yeah, and Maiden being big too was different. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Maiden was like, with Bruce Dickinson, there was a fencing, he used to fence, and they had this like air of sophistication to it. You know what I mean? And Metallica was like dangerous music. It was like you go deep into the underworld with them. They wrote about their material, their subject matter, their songs were about war and death and darkness and just alienation and all this sort of stuff. And it was speaking to people, I think, who were coming out of that Reagan era. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And it added like another wave, another level of that to the consciousness of people before they got into the 90s.
Yeah, and I think the fact that, for better or worse, they at least like they were trying to best themselves and they were trying to challenge themselves. And, it was kind of cool that like this EP was a little bit of like a refresh, like a reboot for them. It's like get back to what started the ride. And then to come out, swinging with that record and pretty much just take over heavy music it's really impressive. I mean, the fact that some promoter was like, the only way we can have Guns N' Roses and Metallica touring the same world is if they do it together. It's fucking insane.
Yeah. And just as a sort of ode to Cliff Burton, who was the heart and soul of the band, really, too. I mean, I attribute a lot of this stuff. I attribute the 5 of these songs that are on this EP. I feel like, in a way, Cliff, if you've read To Live Is to Die, like the biography about Cliff Burton, he kind of was the guy who like steered the whole band, really. Mm-hmm. I mean, sure, Lars was into like new wave of British heavy metal, but Cliff was the architect, I think, of injecting like punk and hardcore into their sound, and having this like street level sort of savvy that these 5 songs I feel are also like an ode to Cliff Burton, and his influence obviously extended onto Injustice for All too. So I mean, apparently he wrote a lot of that material.
One other thing too is that, I mean, when something like this big happens, it's sometimes even hard to contextualize it because you've lived with it for so long. The impact Metallica's, like probably around Master of Puppets and a little, going into Injustice for All, what it had on hardcore bands, because and like Harley Flanagan's been like super frank about it. He's like, I felt like it was some fucking metal motherfuckers playing hardcore, but they were doing it so fucking good, we were jealous, like admitting it. And and then other bands, trying to they're seeing some similarities, but they're not understanding like how differently informed this stuff is. Whether it's the vocal approach or the riff construction, the dynamics, like it is a lot different than sort of like your blueprint New York hardcore, you know?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, the subject matter of the songs too. I mean, but then again, Metallica, like I said, they got pseudo-political, you know, they talked about war. They talked about all this stuff, you know?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting, I don't know. I think like the best bands are, you know, comprised of individuals and then they coalesce as a thing. And I do think you get this pretty eclectic group of guys. I mean, you know, especially you watch that documentary, you're like, how the fuck do these people even form a band? They couldn't be more different, you know, like,
yeah, definitely.
You know, like you can maybe see like the egos that drive it, but like something had to even get those egos to spark, you know? And so to have it come out in this really original thing, and then right as they're clicking, they're at the peak, like for them to kind of be a little humbled and step back and put out a record and really, in a sense, like give a hand-me-down to the fans of like, look, like this is what we like. That's a cool thing to do. It's a cool move.
Totally. You know, it's funny just going back onto other classic records episodes that we've done. You know, these they might not be the obvious choices for a lot of people, but I think that it's turning into is the classic records, the Hall of Fame, is more about what's meaningful to you or to us or whoever, you know, was on the show at the time. And you know, like for example, we did not Mob Rules. We did Heaven and Hell by Sabbath, which is like, some people don't even call that a Black Sabbath record.
Right. You
know what I mean? And to follow suit with that, this is, you know, this Garage Days EP, the 598 EP. I just wanted to underscore how important it was to me and to get that, even though I love, you know, there might be other Metallica records that most people will consider to be classic records, but on a personal level, I think this is like a very impactful sort of 5 songs they could have done.
Yeah, I mean, to contextualize it for me, like this is the advent of me going back into music I like. Like that was the lesson I learned from this, and that's something that carried out, you know, throughout any time I liked a band wanting to go further. You know, like that chain that I don't think exists as much anymore, just because there's been so many things that have happened. But to actually have a genuine curiosity to be like, fuck, these dudes like Diamond Head. This is a ripping song. Like, I want to know what that is like, you know? And then, whoa, Diamond Head's on a compilation with these other bands. What's Angel Witch like? You know, what are these bands like? And then going through like pretty much every band I discovered from there, wanting to know their roots. Like, so that was a pretty, it's kind of a heavy thing when you're like you're a teenager, you know? Cause like you see it, like you have other friends at the same time. Like, who gives a shit?
Yeah, like, totally. Most of my friends didn't give a shit because,
yeah.
And furthermore too, like mentioning these bands, like in 1985, you know, it's almost like being on the flat earth or something like that. It's like, I thought, you know, okay, there's Van Halen, there's Aerosmith, there's AC/DC, you know, I was starting to, you know, Deep Purple, Judas Priest. That could have literally been it. Like that could have been the only bands that made that kind of music to me at that age. You know, it's like, you know, there was like a record store in my hometown called the Book and Record Store, literally. They had a great, whoever bought their records was whoever the buyer, they did a great job. But it was like I said, the same way that no one had Misfits records. They had Ramones, they had Sex Pistols, they had Motorhead, you know, they had Deep Purple, they had Sabbath, all the Sabbath albums, right? Mm-hmm. They had the Iron Maiden records, you know, but that literally could have been the entirety of the hard rock universe to me at that point.
Yeah.
So when this came out, it's like, well, they don't have this at the Book and Record Store.
Right.
So it's like this weird, I have to go somewhere else now and figure out how to get some of this stuff.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Where do you get these things? Like,
yeah,
it's a cool journey, you know, like,
and also just once again, you know, I know that I'm probably significantly older than a lot of the listeners out there. Now, these are the primitive times, the Stone Age world that I come from. I mean, I feel like I came out of a cave, you know what I mean? I feel like I was like communicating with like cave paintings at that point, you know, wearing like a loincloth or something. But this was the reality of the world, is that you only had this tactile experience.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I do remember from this time frame that I touched on before about like starting to get into tape trading is this idea that I would trust some entity, whether be it some ad in a heavy metal magazine, for all I know could be a fucking Ponzi scheme, that I'm going to put money in an envelope. I would cover it with tinfoil. I don't know why, so it didn't look like cash or whatever through the envelope. Send it somewhere with a letter, and then some amount of time would, you know,
usually
elapse,
a long time,
like a long ass time.
Yeah, like a month or two would happen, and you get something in the mail.
Yeah, something appears. So it's like, you know, whether it was like a fanzine or some import cassette or something, but that, you know, you almost felt like once the money was gone, nothing was coming back anyways. So if you did get the shit, like, that's great.
That's another crazy thing, is like, how many times back then did you put cash money in an envelope?
Oh, for sure.
You know, there was no PayPal, like Cash App, none of that stuff. You know what I mean? I didn't have a checking account when I was like 16. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I just had cash. You know, that's it.
I mean, I think like the last thing I'll say about why this record's important, and not just like metaphorically of like, you know, everything when you're young is pivotal, because it's like you're so green. It's the first time you felt it. You remember the first everything, right? But then if you can look back on it and hear those things, or, you know, you read literature and you understand, like, it wasn't just a moment. It was like why it was good. I like when someone who creates something lets me into their world and why they did it. And I think like this cover record is like emblematic of that. In the same way, to parallel it, yeah, I can be on YouTube and play a PIL song, and then it'll play a Faust song after it. But if PIL says to me, we were informed by this Faust record and this Can record, and then I can hear that in the band, that makes me more invested in whatever I'm being exposed to.
Yeah, there's context to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like that context, especially for them to do it in live shows, in interviews, on record, and visually by always promoting other bands, I think it's like a really cool, it's a cool world they established. And, you know, something that they revisited later on when they did the expanded Garage Days and, you know, added more covers and stuff too.
Well, thanks for joining us, Anthony, and thanks everyone for listening out there. And we'll see you soon, or you'll hear us soon. Take care. You've been listening to Metal Matters, a Gimme Radio podcast. We'll be back next week, so be sure to subscribe and never miss out. Also, be sure to check out Gimme Radio via web, iOS, or Android for one of the best metal communities in the world, exclusive interviews and merch, and so much more.